Okay, so typically in high school biology, after photosynthesis is taught, cellular respiration is taught. These two complement each other because what is made ultimately by photosynthesis, which is the glucose, and obviously oxygen, but we've talked about how that is a waste product. The glucose is a primary reactant for cellular respiration. The main thing that cellular respiration does is it takes glucose and it breaks it down and turns it into usable cellular energy. In other words, ATP. The importance of food. So obviously, something is either an autotroph or something is a heterotroph. It's something's an autotroph that is able to make their own food. If something cannot make their own food, then it is a heterotroph. Okay, so it says, food provides living things with the chemical building blocks they need to grow and produce. Food serves as a source of the raw materials for the cells of the body. And finally, food serves as a source of energy. Chemical energy and ATP. Inside living cells, energy can be stored in chemical compounds. One of the principal chemical compounds that cells use and to store and release energy are these two alternating molecules, ADP and ATP. And the reason why I'm calling them alternating molecules is because ATP, when it is used by the cell, breaks that bond between the second and the third phosphate group. So over here, this would be number 1, this would be number 2, and this would be number 3. Right here, this bond gets broken. When this bond right here gets broken, energy gets released because as we have learned, energy is stored in the bonds of molecules. When this third ATP group is removed, it is then turned into ADP, and it floats around and maintains ADP until there is energy that is available to add that phosphate group back on. Okay, it says on here further that ADP is like a poor energy, or is energy poor rather, like a dead battery. But once you add on that third phosphate group and you have that extra bond now, then it becomes ATP, which is energy rich and is like a charged battery. All right, so you've already written this down in your photosynthesis notes. The structure of ATP includes an adenine, which is a nitrogen base, a ribose, which is a kind of sugar, and 3 phosphate groups. How ADP becomes ATP. You have energy available and it adds on that third phosphate group. It has the same initial adenine, it has the 5 carbon ribose sugar, it has 2 phosphate groups. When there's energy available, there's enough energy to bond the third phosphate group back on and becomes from ADP to ATP. Okay, ATP has enough stored energy to power a variety of cellular activities, such as, and you've already written these down in your photosynthesis notes, photosynthesis, protein synthesis, muscle contraction, and active transport across the cell membrane. The ATP molecule is the basic energy source of all living things. In other words, it is the energy that can be used by the cell. So, as I was beginning to say, photosynthesis and cellular respiration are tied together because what is ultimately made by photosynthesis is one of the starting products for respiration. And so it says energy flows into an ecosystem as sunlight and leaves it as heat. Energy cannot be recycled. Energy follows a one-way path through our ecosystem. So we've got the sun, and in this diagram we can see that the sun is being absorbed by the chlorophyll that is located inside the thylakoid membranes, right? Then we have the two products that are made here, which is oxygen gas and glucose. The oxygen gas is released off into the atmosphere. The glucose is consumed by other living things, including being consumed by plants, because plants perform both photosynthesis and this process we're learning right now, cellular respiration. However, heterotrophs only perform the cellular respiration. So plants perform photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Heterotrophs only perform cellular respiration. Let's see. Chemical elements are recycled. Right. So the chemical elements. So they're talking about the carbon, the hydrogen, and the oxygen that is used in glucose. They end up getting recycled. And they end up being made to be used for ATP, and then the glucose gets used by the mitochondria. The mitochondria, as we're going to see in just a moment, makes ATP, water, and carbon dioxide. Photosynthesis needs water and carbon dioxide. It makes glucose. Glucose is used by the mitochondria. And it just goes round and round. Not only is glucose used by the mitochondria, but so is the oxygen gas. Let's see, photosynthesis convert light energy from the sun to chemical energy, and we've already talked about that. Okay, photosynthesis generates oxygen and glucose, which then gets used by the mitochondria of eukaryotic cells for cellular respiration. So sun, I'm just seeing if there's anything here I haven't said. I said this already. Okay, and then the mitochondria actually will produce water and carbon dioxide that the chloroplast will need. Cellular respiration breaks down glucose into simpler substances and releases the stored energy as ATP. Okay, some of the energy is used to make ATP, so I've already said that. Some of the energy is lost as heat. That's kind of like, a byproduct there. Okay, the waste products of respiration are carbon dioxide and water. I've already said that a couple times now. They are then the raw materials for photosynthesis. So you've got carbon dioxide and water, and then the sunlight. Those three components are needed for photosynthesis to occur. Photosynthesis then makes glucose and oxygen we consider a waste product, but in reality, these two are reactants for the ATP. For the mitochondria to be able to produce ATP. Okay, yep, said this already too. While only green plants carry out photosynthesis, and I don't really like how it says green plants. It's actually plants. It doesn't have to be a green plant. It can be any color plant, because all plants make their own food. So while only plants carry out photosynthesis, all living things must carry out respiration. Okay, overview of respiration. Cellular respiration is the process that releases energy by breaking down glucose and other food molecules in the presence of oxygen. Because we breathe in oxygen. Where does this oxygen come from? It comes in for people, we breathe in the oxygen from the atmosphere, and then it travels from our lungs into our capillaries, into our blood system, and is carried through different areas of our body, obviously, right? So all of our cells that have mitochondria are able to receive the oxygen ultimately from the atmosphere, and then we obtain the glucose through the foods that we eat, and that's what is needed for cellular respiration. Cellular respiration is the process of converting glucose into ATP. The equation for respiration is there is 1 molecule of glucose plus 6 molecules of oxygen gas. And right here where this question mark is, that's where the arrow should be, right? Remember the arrow that means yields. So on one side is the reactants and on the other side is the products. So we have 1 molecule of glucose and 6 molecules of oxygen gas will yield, arrow goes right there, 6 molecules of carbon dioxide plus 6 molecules of water and 38 ATP. All right, so there is much energy stored in 1 molecule of glucose. This energy must be released in small, controlled steps. If all the energy from glucose were released at once, most of it would be lost as heat and light. So little bits of it get turned into ATP at a time. The energy stored in glucose will be released bit by bit, and this energy will be used to make ATP. The energy cannot be released from glucose all at once. It would be the equivalent of the gas tank in your car exploding in one single reaction, rather than in small, controlled combustions that drive your car. There are 2 types of respiration. One is called aerobic respiration, which means it requires oxygen, and the other one is called anaerobic respiration, which means it does not require oxygen. However, respiration takes a specific pathway before it needs to determine if it's going to be go into the aerobic respiration pathway or the anaerobic respiration pathway. Okay, so there are 3 stages to cellular respiration. The first one is called glycolysis. It says that it is anaerobic. This is how respiration starts always, through an anaerobic process. Okay, so when back here, it's going to seem a little bit confusing because right here we talk about there being 2 types of cellular respiration. One is aerobic, needing oxygen, and one is anaerobic, does not require oxygen. However, when we talk about the 3 main stages, and the first one is glycolysis, that's how they all start. Okay? After glycolysis, there is oxygen or there is not oxygen available. And so then the products of glycolysis, which we're going to see in a minute, they follow a certain pathway depending on whether there is or isn't oxygen available. If there is oxygen available, it will go through glycolysis, then the Krebs cycle, and then the electron transport chain. And the electron transport chain might sound a little bit similar to what we learned in photosynthesis, because in photosynthesis there is also an electron transport chain. Okay, so before we go a lot further, I'm going to let you know that there's a lot of detail here and that I want you to try to stay with me. I want you to try to take the notes down. But when it comes time for the actual quiz, I'm going to narrow down to a lot more specific parameters what you actually need to know for the quiz. Okay, so just do your best to stay with me on the lecture. Make sure that you're writing all of the notes down. And don't freak out about how much information there is, because there really is a lot. All right, here we go. So glycolysis occurs in the cytoplasm, okay, of the actual cell. But the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain, that part occurs in the mitochondria of all living things, not just of plants, but of all living things. So here we have an example of a plant cell, but this Krebs cycle and electron transport chain, and glycolysis for that matter, these happen in both animal and plant cells. I already read that, and we already got that. Okay. Glycolysis is the process in which 1 molecule of glucose is oxidized to produce 2 molecules of pyruvic acid. This is something you need to know. What exactly is glycolysis? It's the first step in respiration that takes glucose, and which has 6 carbons, right? It is a molecule that contains 6 carbons, and it breaks it into 2 molecules of pyruvic acid. And each of these pyruvic acids only have 3 carbons each. So if we're looking at this molecule right here, where we see the dark gray circles, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, this is the carbon chain. So there are 6 carbons in glucose, and that is going to be oxidized. In other words, it's going to be broken down, and you're going to end up with 2 molecules of pyruvic acid. Both of them have 3 carbons each. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, and these dark circles, 1, 2, 3. That is the main thing that glycolysis does. Well, it also produces ATP. We'll see that in just a minute. But very little ATP. It's not very efficient. Okay, steps in glycolysis. So just try and stay with me. Glucose, 6 carbons, uses a little bit of energy. So it uses 2 ATPs, and it's going to release, it's going to perform this chemical reaction using a little bit of energy to make it occur. And this is going to make 2 molecules of PGAL. Okay, and I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, which is not the pyruvic acid yet. So it says the energy of 2 ATP is used to convert glucose into 2 molecules of PGAL. Whoop, too fast. Okay, 2 molecules of PGAL will then be oxidized to produce 2 molecules of the pyruvic acid. Pyruvic acid, as I've already said, is a 3-carbon compound. Okay, so it's just a little bit of rearranging of molecules again from PGAL, which is similar in structure to pyruvic acid, but not exactly the same. As the PGAL is oxidized, 2 molecules of NAD+ will be reduced to 2 molecules of NADH. These will be used in the electron transport chain because we've got this extra hydrogen that has now been attached that is acting as an ion. Just looking through here. Okay. The oxidation of PGAL also results in the production of 4 ATP. So as the PGAL is turned into the pyruvic acid, notice what's happening right here. You see this phosphorus group and this one right here. They both get released, and that's able to be added to some of this this ADP to turn ADP into ATP again. The pyruvic acid may, from here, enter the mitochondria for the Krebs cycle. So in other words, the pyruvic acid will either enter the mitochondria if there is oxygen present, or if there is not oxygen present, it's going to remain in the cytoplasm for a different process called fermentation. Okay, so in cellular respiration, glycolysis is always the first step. Does not take any oxygen for glycolysis to occur. Glycolysis occurs in the cytoplasm. However, after the glucose has been broken down all the way down into the pyruvic acid, if there's oxygen present, it's going to go to the mitochondria. If there's not oxygen present, it will go and stay in the cytoplasm because glycolysis occurs in the cytoplasm. Let's see. Yeah, I kind of want to get through this part on glycolysis. So, ATP production. 2 molecules of ATP are consumed at the beginning, but 4 molecules of ATP are produced by the end. So that means overall glycolysis has a gain of 2 ATP. So let's go to this slide real quick. For glucose to do the initial break from 6 carbons into 2 molecules of 3 carbons each, 2 ATP are used. However, when the PGAL gets oxidized, what happens is we've got this release of these phosphate groups, and now they can add back to the ADP and make ATP. So here 4 ATP are made. Here 2 ATP are used. So that is called has a net gain of 2 ATP. So that's another aspect that you need to know, is that glycolysis makes 2 ATP. But that's not really a whole lot. So it's rather inefficient because there's no oxygen available. It says, even though cellular respiration is an energy-releasing process, in other words, cellular respiration takes that glucose and breaks down the glucose into ATP. That's what it means by energy releasing. The cell must invest a small amount of energy to get the reaction going, because I've told you guys that it takes energy to break bonds. You might end up with more energy after you break the bond, but it always takes a certain amount of energy to break a bond. And in this case, it takes 2 ATPs to start that breaking apart, but in the end, you end up with 4, and that's how you end up again with that net 2. All right, let's see. All right, so this is definitely not, this part I'm not going to, you're not going to be responsible for knowing really. But I'm just going to go ahead and make sure you fill in your slides anyway. This says, I am NAD, the hydrogen acceptor. Just like we have in photosynthesis, there's a hydrogen acceptor. It's NADP in photosynthesis. Here, it's just NAD+. The other one is NADP+. This one is NAD+. Both of them accept hydrogen. My job is to carry hydrogen into the electron transport chain. During this reaction, 2 high-energy electrons are removed from each of the PGALs. The electrons are passed to the electron acceptor NAD+. NAD+ in respiration is similar to NADP+ in photosynthesis. Each NAD+ accepts a pair of electrons to form NADH. This NADH holds the electrons until they can be transferred to other molecules. NAD+ helps pass the energy from glucose to other pathways in the cells. Okay, so next, advantages and disadvantages of glycolysis. So I'll read this, but then I'm going to basically break down what I want you to know about the advantages and disadvantages. Glycolysis only produces a gain of 2 ATP per molecule of glucose, but the process is so fast that thousands of ATP are produced in just a few milliseconds. Another advantage of the glycolysis is that it does not require oxygen. Energy can be produced for the cell even if no oxygen is present. Okay, what I want you to know as far as the advantage of glycolysis is that it does produce 2 ATPs. From all of that, that's what I really want you to know. It produces 2 ATPs. Disadvantage. If the cell relied on only glycolysis for ATP production, the cell would quickly run out of the NAD+ to accept the hydrogen electrons. So without the NAD+, the cell cannot keep glycolysis going and ATP production would stop. To keep glycolysis going, the NADH must deliver their high-energy cargo of electrons to another pathway and then return to glycolysis to be used again. Okay, so from all of that, what do I really want you to know about the disadvantage of glycolysis? That it is not particularly efficient. It only has a net 2 ATP, and ATP is the go-to energy for the entire cell. So it takes a lot of cellular energy to be able to keep all of those different organelles running and all of the different proteins that need to be made and all of the active transport that needs to occur, right? The muscle contractions, all of that stuff that the cell needs in order to be able to live and function, it needs ATP. If the only method of making ATP was glycolysis, the cell would die because it just would not be able to keep up with the energy demand. And I think that is where we are going to stop this one.